Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Your clergy team is faithfully gathered in our favorite space, the Gann Chapel. We're taping today, thank you, Andrew Hanold, on Wednesday, September the 18th, and of course this is being shown on Shabbat, September the 21st. Dear colleagues, today we're going to talk about the power of life stories, of seeing your life not just as a random series of events or years that just grow and accumulate, but when you step back in this season of Elul, when you step back a few weeks before Rosh Hashanah, and you see the current chapter, the you that you are now, in the context of a full story of your childhood to your aspirations for the rest of your life, what themes emerge? What are the themes of your life? What's the trajectory of your life? David Brooks, in his book, that's where I got this from, How to Know a Person, talks about the power of seeing your life not as random events, or you're just muddling through without reflection. But he invites us to think about, are we in a noble struggle? Is our life about something substantial? Is our life about something that's consequential? Are we involved in a noble struggle? And what is that noble, and what is that struggle, and what does that demand of us? And we're going to look at that from the stuff that David Brooks offers, and then, of course, in our Torah reading, we have the exact same thing. We have the classic canonical story of the Jewish people that is in Kitavo, and it's also at the seder. It's in the Haggadah. It's the center of our story. We're going to look at our personal story and our national story. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, v'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
So in his book, How to Know a Person, David Brooks has a whole chapter called Life Stories, and he begins by telling the story of a professor at Northwestern, a psychology professor, whose expertise is in helping people construct life narratives. Their life narratives. His name is Dan McAdams, capital A, Adams. And what he does is he invites people to be research subjects and to come to the Northwestern campus and to give him 4 hours, and he's going to pay them a research fee, and he's going to ask these ordinary citizens, tell me your life story. And the prompts are, what are the high points of your life? What are the lowest points of your life? And what are the inflection points, the transition points of your life? And McAdams says what happens is so interesting. First of all, it was a deeply emotional experience, that many of the people were actually weeping when they relate their life story in that way. When they talk about the hardest parts, the lowest points, they actually wept. And he said, at the end, most people were elated. There's something just relieving and gratifying and made people feel seen and heard to be able to share their life story to somebody who was interested in hearing it. And then he said most people reported that they had never before even thought about their life story. And this was the first time they had ever even tried to construct a life story. It just never occurred to them to see their life as a life story. They were living their life, getting through the day, what's on my to-do list, oh, my phone, I got pinged, I got dinged, I got ringed, I got to go do, right? But nobody had actually thought, wow, why am I here in my 70, 80, 90, whatever number of years God gives me? What's the point of it, and what's the story, and what's the trajectory? They found it really powerful. And he said at the end that many of the subjects said, I don't want your money. You don't need to pay me. I should pay you. This was like a privilege to tell my life story. So that was ringing in my head when I started studying for our weekly Torah portion, Kitavo. And of course, as always happens, the Torah portion is on point. So we have the canonical official story of the Jewish people. The context is Moses is telling the people, when you go to Israel, you're going to be farmers and you're going to farm the land. And when you get the first fruits, You're going to take a basket of those figs and pomegranates and grapes and barley. You're going to take it to the temple, and then you're going to be an intentional reflective practitioner of farming. You're not just going to eat the barley and eat the pomegranates and eat the grapes. You're going to take it to the temple, and you're going to make a proclamation. And that proclamation is the life story of the Jewish people. So, Michelle, I was wondering if you would read it for us. It's something that we all know. Friends at home, when you hear this and you think, oh, this is familiar, it's also because you hear it not only in Kitavo, our reading today, but also because it is the centerpiece of the Haggadah. It's the center of the seder. So, Michelle, please read along. My father.
My father was a fugitive, sometimes wandering, Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me.
Thank you, Michelle. So, colleagues, what comes up for you when you hear the official story of the Jewish people? What does that evoke in you? What reactions do you have in hearing that?
It's so visceral. I love it so much. It just reminds me of, like, there's so many cultures, not only our culture, that has origin stories, and those origin stories go to our personal as well as collective identities. And I love it because I love ritual. That's what I do, and the ritualization of the story, I think, also is very resonant with me personally. And I think it's also, as you mentioned, I mean, when people gather for their sedarim and come to this point in the seder, I think it's seminal, and I think that even though no matter where people are in their Jewish journeys, it centers everyone.
I love this on two levels. The first level I love it on is, of course, that it's the core of our story here, and it is so important to tell our story. But the second level is actually that they're receiving this when they're not yet in the land, when they haven't yet planted any of those fruits. This hasn't happened. They don't have those first fruits in their hands yet. And we're being taught this practice of gratitude and of reflection back on our story as an act of gratitude.
Michelle, could you just go a little bit deeper on that point, which is the meaning that you make of the fact that Moses is imagining a gratitude ceremony for first fruits that don't yet exist? Do you think, is that like that process, what's it called, manifesting? Yeah. Like, I'm going to manifest, I'm going to think about that I am a farmer, I'm going to think about my pomegranate, and then it's going to, what do you think what's the lesson to be learned here?
To me, it's so beautiful because it's so real. So often when we get somewhere, we take for granted the fact that we're there, and we don't remember the roots, the struggle, the hardships that brought us to that place. And this is articulating, no, every year you're going to come, you're going to remember that this is actually one part of a very long story that had struggle and also celebration, and we have to hold all of that.
But also, what I'm hearing you say in your first comment is about vision and dreaming.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
they're not yet in Israel, they're on the wrong side of the River Jordan, and Moses is almost imploring them, just manifest this basket of fruit before you even have this basket of fruit.
No, he doesn't believe it. He knows it.
He knows it, even though it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Elias, what comes up for you with this statement of
the first thing
our
that
history?
comes to me, in comparison with the other texts that you are, here and you bring to us to examine, is I see a contradiction, and the contradiction may be obvious. The contradiction is that if we think about telling our story, our own personal stories, all right, we would say, I did this and I did that, and this happened to me and this, that, but when this happened, I did this, you know. It's like we are part of the story. In the biblical text, it's only God. It's like we were in a bad situation, we prayed, and God answered us. God took us out from Egypt, and God gave us the land. I'm wondering, I mean, none of us will tell our own story these days using those words.
So what meaning do you make, Elias, of the God-centric nature of this narrative? Is that a problem for you? Does it bring you closer, or does it push you farther away?
I mean, this is the language we use every day in temple, right? This is what we do, synagogue. We pray and we use it all the time and we teach it. But it's I don't speak in those terms.
So does
You
it
know, when I
feel-
think about coming from Argentina, I don't think, you know, God took me out of Argentina and put me here in Boston and gave me this and that. No. It was my hard work, my sacrifice, and the pain and the happiness. And yes, perhaps God was along the way, but I wouldn't describe it this way.
Yeah,
Of course, this is a biblical text, and it's
Right.
like 3,000 years old, 2,000 years old. So it's hard to do a comparison with these days.
I disagree with you. Think about how many times that when you're speaking to people, and they will say, "Thank God I had a good scan," or "Thank God that this happened," or "Thank God this didn't happen." I really believe that people subconsciously still believe that God is very much a part of their trajectory and story.
Mm. Well, that is.
I mean, yeah, just to clarify, you know, I'm a man of, I pray. That's what I do that's what I do for a living. And I pray both ways. I pray with the text,
Yeah.
and then sometimes I close my seder and I pray with my own words and thoughts.
Michelle's gracious invitation at every Kabbalah Shabbat.
Exactly.
Either say the words that are on the book or ignore the book and just go with your heart. You
No,
say
listen,
it nicer than that.
listen,
but
for example,
that's basically what you say.
I mean, this is a personal thing, but every time I fly to Argentina, all right, I pray before going and I pray after coming. Yeah. And I thank God most of the time for everything went well. But I wouldn't necessarily say that my achievements in life have been because of God, right, and because of God only.
Right.
But
Okay.
we have that text though.
Yeah.
That's part of our Torah. You know, we say, you know, it's not
comparing the two
yeah.
texts that
Thank
are
you,
here.
thank you, Elias. That is a distinction worth noting and marinating on. Elisa, how did this text land with you?
What was interesting, I love this conversation so much, all the different valences. For me, I was reading it thinking about the tension between individualism and communal identity. And that this text, you've got to imagine that in Egypt, everybody had their own unique experiences, and some people had it worse than others, and some people cried out more than others. And some people, it was probably okay. Like, they were probably figuring out how to do all right, and, like, it wasn't so uncomfortable. But, like, they all had this sort of narrative. And I'm wondering about, like, where's the individual in this narrative, both in the moment that they're receiving this, because everybody in the desert has their own experience, and we know that they all talk about, you know, some people weren't so excited to be liberated. Some people really did want to go back. And so where's the individual in this moment? And then in the future moment, I'm thinking about, like, you know, the farmer that gets up and they get all their kids ready and they get the crops ready and they schlep to the, like, is this really what they want to say when they get there? Like, do they want to just be like, oh, I was up all night with a baby and then I was just, like, exhausted and, like, I don't know if the crop's going to come in and do I really have enough to, like, there's just, the personal story is really lost. And to me, there's this power. It's one of the struggles that we're having right now as a people, which is how do we get the next generation to identify with our communal story and our communal narrative? And how do we get them to make that their story that's not about my life, it's about our life and our community's life?
All right.
There's also this little extra interesting gloss at the bottom of the page. I don't know if you noticed this little commentary, but there's apparently a tradition back from the Mishnah time that you have to say this, and if you knew it, you would just say it. And if you didn't know it, there would be a prompter there that could help prompt you so that each word by word you'd be able to say it. But eventually the people right, exactly as you're saying, who didn't know the Hebrew didn't come, at least according to this, because they were embarrassed, because it wasn't feeling like it was their story. They were part of that. They didn't know how to engage that, and therefore they apparently ruled that everybody should have a prompter so that everyone was on an equal level, whether you knew it or not, that it felt like you were part of the story.
But so interesting that they didn't say, you know what? Here's sort of the general principle. Come and speak words of your heart. Put the book down, as you would say on Shabbat Live. Put the book down and just speak words of your heart about gratitude and about our communal narrative and about this moment. That never
Right.
became a thing.
So I'm loving this conversation because, 4 Jews, 5 opinions, and you all have different reads, and they're all so interesting. I want to, Lisa, go to your point about the I versus we, me versus we, and note that you raised the question that for the entirety of the story, once the story gets going, it's in we. We cry to the Lord, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand. He brought us to this place. It's all us, gave us this land flowing with milk and honey. It's we, it's us. But the last, the close of it is, wherefore I now bring the first fruits. Va'ata hine heveti et reshit pri ha'adama. I bring it. So it goes from we to me at the very end. And I guess I am wondering, could you say a bit more about, what do you think is the intent of structuring the prayer this way, of making it a we prayer, us, our, and then it closes, it concretizes at the end with I now do. What is the lesson there?
To me, it feels like what is being solidified, that my life and my actions are not about me. They're a response to a communal story, to a communal narrative, and my job as an individual is to live our communal story and to do what I can to make whatever moments I encounter holy and in line with what has come before me.
Right.
And I emerge from a we.
Right.
Bruce Feiler, in his book on parenting,
Right.
which is already many years ago
Right.
now, spoke about how critical it is when you're raising a child. All the research that he did resulted in sort of a revelation and understanding that should not have really been a revelation, which is our children need
Right.
to understand who they are within the context of their family, within the context of their community. Who am I emerges from who are we.
Right. And then at the end, right, what happens after the proclamation, the liturgy, is the farmer gives the basket of fruit to the priest, and then they eat a meal together. So it ends with a me instead of a we, but the me is in the context of a we. So I want to ask, I have the following question, which is, what is not in this history? Whenever you distill a history, by the nature of a distillation, something's got to be left out. It's not an anthology, it's a distillation, so something's left out. What's left out? What is not in the farmer's official canonical Jewish history that's also in our seder table that is surprising to you, if anything? Anything?
It feels like so many things are left out. I mean, like,
Please.
when you're thinking about a narrative of a people, you could imagine that they would include like all the family squabbles and the times that so-and-so didn't agree with each other and the fights that broke out. You could imagine them talking about the moments of pain of the people not all being in alignment, not all being clear they wanted to leave Egypt. You could imagine them talking about also successes that achievements that they would have, ability that they had to form judges and to form, a civilization and to build a community. You could imagine them talking about feelings, how they felt when,
Right.
but there's so much absent.
Yeah, I mean, when you graft the text that we have on the Dan McAdams questions in David Brooks's book, you have high point, low point, and transition point. So low point is obviously slavery. We were oppressed, and we groaned, and we moaned, and we called out to God. That's the low point. High point is the Exodus. God redeems us with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Transition point, we get into the land of Israel, and now we're farmers, and now we settle into daily life as a sovereign nation. So low point, slavery; high point, Exodus; transition point, we're in Eretz Israel living. But a lot of the other details are omitted. One of the things that I wanted to just surface, this is my reaction to it, was what's so striking about what's omitted to me is Torah, is Sinai. And it's kind of very meta, because we only read this in the Torah. We only know about it from the Torah. The quote that Michelle brought from the bottom of the page comes from the Mishnah, the oral Torah, right? And the whole Sinai thing, like the Ten Commandments, like Exodus 20, is just completely missing for this farmer. What meaning do you make of that, if anything?
Well, but that's the other thing that's fascinating to me. There's also no meaning of this individual person's, like, there's no meaning. That part of what I understood from the Brooks piece is that what makes people feel elated is when they can understand a trajectory of their life and why they're here and what they're doing this for. And not only is there no Torah, but there's no, like, why did God bring us to this land? There's also no answer to that question.
What is your meaning? What do you see here?
Well, what I took away from this, Elias, is, and the way it really connected with Brooks, and we can go from that to pivot, is in Brooks's analysis, he quotes this line that is just so powerful. I want to print it out, laminate it, put it on my desk in a big poster. I love this. When I read it 2, 3, 4 times, and it's just so simple and profound. He writes, "All sorrows can be borne if you put them into a story," as the Danish writer Isak Dinesen said. All sorrows can be borne if you put them into a story. And what I took away from this was that the sorrow that was born was being slaves for 430 years. And the way that can be born is you put into a story, which is a redemption story. We were slaves, and now we're freed. And because we were slaves, therefore we're going to have compassion for other people who are vulnerable. So it's going to lean forward into positive conduct. I'm going to take my history of suffering and slavery and have empathy for the oppressed. And also, again, the thing right after the prayer is they eat. So it's about gratitude. In other words, because we were slaves, now I have intense empathy, and now I have intense gratitude. All sorrows can be borne if they're part of a story. So that was what I took away, and that's my question. I'm thinking about what the brokenness, the sorrows that we all carry, how do we put it into a story that somehow amounts to a redemption story, where because of that suffering, because of that sorrow, we're now better and stronger. So with that, I want to pivot to the combination of David Brooks's Torah and also the Farmer's Declaration. How do you see that life story, or the national story of the Jewish people, applying to the Jewish people in the 20th century?
Yeah, I want to start by saying I'm not sure in some ways that Brooks is right, although he is right. I mean, he's thinking like a 21st century, a 20th century, 19th century thinker, in the sense that that's when people begin to be educated, but we still have millions of people around the world that are not educated, that really don't have a life story, don't have a trajectory to go from the universal to the particular. You think about, okay, I'm a slave, I'm born in Egypt, this is the year 200 of slavery. What is my story? Well, do I have a story? Do I not have a story? After the Exodus, we have a story. But before that, in the middle of that, do we have a story? So I think that's a little complex.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, thank you for that, because that's, people, if you're Ukrainian, 18 or 19-year-old, and you have to leave your war, and now you're dead with the battle, or if you're an Israeli who was living your life and raising your family and doing your job, and now you're in Gaza for 3 or 4 tours of duty, or if you are one of the 6 million who had the misfortune of being born in Poland or in Eastern Europe or in Germany in 1932, all of those, their stories are crushed by history in some way. So I think that's a very important corrective.
But we don't always see the end of our stories. And that's actually, I think, the strength of having that story. And I just have to disagree a tiny bit. I don't think you need to be educated to have a story. People have been telling stories in tribes, in communities, and families for longer than
Right.
any
But-
of us could imagine. It's about belonging, right? When you think about those, the believing, belonging, access, the belonging is really strong when you're telling a story. And sometimes your part in the story. I mean, I think about last night we were here with a group who is interested in going on the March of the Living with us this coming year, and we had some March of the Living folks from our last trip come and share their stories. And one of the participants said, which place really moved me so much. There was a museum in Poland where they had these jars that they had buried. And inside the jars were these little pieces of paper that people had written on. And they wrote, knowing, I'm not going to make it, but here's my story. I need you to know it. And that matters so much.
So, Michelle, how do you, you and Elias are running this March of the Living program, from Auschwitz to Jerusalem. How do you see that kind of move intersecting with this life story or the national story of the Jewish people? And how do you see it with the notion that sorrows can be borne if they're part of a larger redemptive story?
Yeah, to me, it's. I mean, I agree with David Brooks in the sense that if the story ends well, you can put the sorrows in a bigger context to say what I learned from this situation. But as you mentioned it before, so many people, so many lives are truncated, and they don't have to. Not only they cannot tell the story, but also the story doesn't make any sense because the struggles were worth nothing because their lives were struggles.
Right. And by the way, and that, Dan, I don't agree with you. I agree with Michelle about your education piece. I don't think it has to do with education, but I'm really grateful to you for this because even if you take a look at the Farmer's Declaration, it's always bothered me. Pesach has always bothered me. If you're one of the slaves who was born into slavery, lived as a slave, and died as a slave before the time of the 10 plagues, you're just screwed. And what's the message for the people who are just screwed? What's the message? What's the consolation for the 6 million who they never got to the redemption? They never got to Israel. They never got to a future. And how do you see this intersecting with that? And that's always made me uncomfortable about Yetziat Mitzrayim. It was only the Exodus for the people who were alive to witness it. And if you died beforehand, you weren't. Michelle, what wisdom do you have?
So to me, those jars really are so evocative, and it's why I believe so strongly in doing something like going on the March of the Living and seeing this testimony, because it reminds us that not all of us are blessed to be able to bring our first fruits, but we're still part of a people that has a more transcendent, bigger, our stories are bigger than ourselves. And to me, that gives me comfort. We don't always know if any one chapter is going to end well, but we do know that over the course of hundreds, thousands of years, of generations, that we're part of something bigger.
Right.
I think it's really particularly important in this moment. Elias, you asked me to look through the book that Michael Bonin had translated with Rachel Korazim, and it's so searing. It's so painful to read through each of those poems, which just testify again and again and again a break in the fabric of our universe. And yet in reading that and in holding that testimony, I feel like their voices go farther.
To me, Wes, picking up on what you said about the slaves when we tell the story of Pesach, I always have a similar thing, but with the Holocaust. I always wonder, this hypothetical kind of naive thing that, if you would have told a person who is going to perish in the Holocaust, 4 years from now there will be a Jewish state, so you are not going to die in vain. Would have that been consolation for them? We don't know. Right. I mean, this idea of the individual to the group, for a greater cause. So it's always that I always puzzle, myself with that.
And I think that having that healthy edge and skepticism that there's no bow on that box is really healthy, because it's very tempting to say, oh, this typology fits snugly with mid-20th century Jewish history. 1941 to 1945 made 1948 possible. Because of the Holocaust, we have the State of Israel, so you see every sorrow can be borne. But it's just obviously not so tidy and not so simple for 6 million reasons. And so you're left with some disquiet there. I want to pivot in our last, as we wrap up, I just want to ask the question, how does this whole notion of our personal story and of our people's national story intersect with October 7th and with the year since October 7th? How do you see these two things connecting?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that obviously the story of redemption, that for a moment we perhaps, or for a few years, we thought that we achieved, is not quite there.
I think also Moshe gives us instruction. He's predicting the future, which means he can also predict all of the wars and all of the intensity and all of the pain and challenge that is in the future. And despite it all, this is the ritual that we have to do. And so it feels important to say that whatever our challenges, we don't actually know anything about this farmer's life or what they're experiencing or challenge in the land or challenge in their personal life. And so our challenge is to summon the power of the story of our ancestors and to bring that gratitude and that power and that destiny to the moment that we're living, and trust that by doing that, that's all that we have to do.
Yeah. And I love that this is in this parsha, and it fits nicely, as you say. It has a nice little bow. But I'm not sure that this is.
Well, no, I said it doesn't have a bow. There's no bows.
Right.
I don't do bows.
I'm not
don't do
sure
bows.
that this is the right part of the Torah for our moment. It really feels like we're Bamidbar right now, and we're not yet in the place that the farmer is at. We're much more in the place where, Deuteronomy, where Moses is, where we have to know it, where we have to believe it so deeply, so firmly in our soul that it can come to pass, it will come to pass. That's hard. That's really hard work, and it's much more it's much less disconcerting to say, okay, how about we just sit in Bamidbar? And this ask of visualizing that farmer, it's a big ask.
Dan, as we wrap up,
Yeah,
last
I
thought.
was thinking about that also. So I'm thinking about the sense of story. I think we're all thinking of it in a linear way, but I just thought it's really not. It's more like a gyre where we come to different points, and those points will continue to resonate. So we have redemption. We have the state of Israel, and yet we are back to that other point, and the gyre just keeps going.
So, in wrapping up, here's what I would say about this. This is, to me, this text from the Torah, Kitavo and David Brooks, super helpful in helping me think about October 7th a year later in the following way. All sorrows can be borne if you put them into a story. I really like that for our personal lives. I'm thinking about that in terms of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur coming up. I think with all the edge and the skepticism and questions that we've raised and that you just gave voice to, Elias, broadly speaking, that paradigm kind of applies to the 20th century, because the fact is that the Jewish people has made meaning out of the Holocaust by saying never again, right? And that one of the reasons for Israel, not the only reason for Israel, there's many reasons for Israel, one of the reasons for Israel is it's a safe place for Jews. No more killing of Jews. No more Jewish blood is free. We're going to have an army, we're going to have a state, we're going to be able to defend ourselves. No more pogroms for the Jews, and we're never going to be vulnerable like we were from 1941 to 1945. So it's the deepest sorrow for which there are no words, and it's the deepest sorrow for which there is no consolation. But there is a lesson of never again. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. That's the oral Torah of the Jewish people. Never again is the collective response of our people's soul to the Holocaust. Never again. And that's why for 76 years, Israeli soldiers would say, Shenit Matzada lo tipol. A second time, Masada is not going to fall. Never again. I think the pain of October 7th is there's no story to put this in. There's no story. There's no coherent narrative. October 7th happened because our beloved Israel was broken as a people, where it's a 50-50 country, and terrible tragedy struck as a result. And a year later, we're no closer to really solving our deepest problems, either with our enemies or within. And I think this whole set of texts gives voice to why October 7th was so hard and remains so hard. And I guess it points us to the future direction that healing would take place, which is that as a people, we come together, as a people we learn, and as a people we find a redemption story that we build together. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.